Welcome everyone to our first video for chapter 10, which is looking at how species are related. So we have looked at how species can evolve, so through mutations, natural selection, eventually we can have the formation of different species. Now what we're doing is we're looking at the relationships between those species. So what evolved from what, and what evidence we have of these older versions of species even existing. So that's what we're going to be looking at in chapter 10. So in this video, we're going to be looking at 10A, which is the fossil record. So we're going to be looking at how we can use the fossil record to look at changes in species over time and how we can use two different dating methods to do this. So changes in species over time. So the fossil record is pretty much all the information that we have derived from fossils throughout our entire existence. So it's arranged in chronological order and it basically maps the history of all species on Earth. So obviously we don't know everything yet, but we have found a lot of stuff out already. For instance, the all living things evolved from a single-celled prokaryote that existed 3.8 billion years ago. So you can see this wheel of time, it gets read in a clockwise direction. This pink bit here is where life was first, that's the first evidence of life that we've found through fossils. And then there's a bunch of other things that you can note on this timeline. So for instance, over here, 2,000 million years ago is when first eukaryotes existed. So it was all little single-celled prokaryotes up until about 2,000 million years ago. And this is because these prokaryotes would have kept reproducing, the selection pressures would have kept on changing, and speciation would have been occurring right up until where we are today as Homo sapiens and all of the other species on Earth. So it's very cool. So the way that we found all of this evidence for the relatedness between species is through the fossil record. So what the fossil record is, it's basically a collection of all the fossils that we have found and that we have studied to look at evolutionary changes over time. So sometimes when the right conditions are present, and that's why we don't have fossils for everything, because the conditions have to be perfect, we can have the remains of a body preserved as a fossil. But the conditions are really specific, and that's why fossils are so rare to find. So what needs to happen is the organism, of course, needs to die, but it also needs to be rapidly covered. And this is the bit that normally doesn't happen, because if it's just died out in the open, it's not going to be covered rapidly. So it needs to be covered rapidly in sediment, which means that it's not exposed to oxygen or microorganisms. So this is really important because normally when things die, there's kind of decay, they get eaten. So it's really important that it's covered and not exposed to any of these things so it can be preserved. Then what happens is that the sediment layers build up over time. So rock is made up of, sedimentary rock's made up of all of these layers. So if something, dies on the ground here, frowny face, dead. Eventually, sediment's going to be, placed on top of that. So it's going to be buried underground, and then it's going to be more sediment, more sediment, more sediment. So this sedimentary rock forms layers, and within this rock, the fossils can be permealized or molded or casted. So this basically means that they just harden. And we also need other conditions like cool temperatures, low light exposure. So it needs to be really, really perfect conditions to get these fossils. And we can use these fossils to study relationships. And we can also find out the age of things. We can also use trace fossils. So trace fossils are indirect evidence of an organism's existence, such as footprints. So we might see, a little cast of a little footprint up here, and we can also use this as evidence for species. So this is a little diagram here that can show you that. So the dinosaur, it dies in a river, which means it can get rapidly covered. These sedimentary layers accumulate over time. The conditions are perfect. There's low oxygen, low light exposure, and then eventually the Earth's movement is going to expose that fossil or those skeletons. So the Earth will eventually move in such a way that these fossils can become discovered. There'll probably be a lot of fossils under the ground right now that we can't get to, and then within the next, couple of hundred years or so are eventually going to surface that we can have a look at. So we use the fossil record to obviously see whether species existed, but we can also tell how old things are. And we're going to look at two different ways that we can date a fossil and therefore date an organism and see how long ago it existed. So the fossil record is ultimately used to date fossils. That's really the whole point. And there's two different methods that it can use. It can use relative dating, or we can use absolute dating. So in relative dating, we're trying to find a relative age of a fossil. So it's not an absolute exact age. It's just kind of like a time frame that we can use to date a fossil in a relative sense. And we can do this by comparing its position to other fossils or comparing where it is in the sedimentary rock. So like we talked about before, we know that things will obviously die. They're going to get covered in sediment, and these sediment layers are going to build up over time. So we have this thing called the law of fossil succession. And this basically states that because we know that this sediment forms layers over time, things that are closer to the surface are going to be younger because they've been covered by less sediment and therefore they've been buried for less time. And things that are buried deeper inside of the rock are older because they have more sedimentary rock layers that have laid on top of them. And knowing these sedimentary rock layer ages allows us to give fossils a relative age. So we can assume that this fish is obviously going to be a lot older species than this primate or whatever's sitting higher up. So this allows us to date fossils using rock stratum. We can also use other things. So as well as knowing the rock stratum age, which is really helpful, we can also use things called index and transitional fossils that can help us determine the ages of new fossils that we find. So index fossils are fossils that come from an organism that's really well known. So something like this, for instance, we know a lot about it. We know exactly when it existed. We know where it existed. We know the time period. We know the geographical location. So we know a lot about this fossil. And we can use it as an index fossil because if it's sitting in the same rock stratum as fossil Y, we can assume that it existed at a pretty similar time to the index fossil that we know lots about. So an index fossil, the best kind, are always going to be physically distinctive. So that means that we can tell exactly what they are really quickly. They had a large population, so that means there should be lots of them around. They've existed in many geographical areas, so they should be in lots of parts of the world, so we can use them widely. And they should have only lived for a short time period. This is really important because if the fossil that we're using has lived for millions and millions and millions of years, that doesn't really narrow down the age of a fossil in its equivalent strata because we know that it's existed for a long period of time. So to be a good index fossil, a really short period of time is going to let us more accurately determine when a nearby fossil is going to be of similar age to it. So we can use index fossils to figure out the age of fossils as well. We can also use transitional fossils. So these will show traits between common ancestral groups and descendant species and shows different, times along the evolutionary pathway. So we can also use things like this to kind of become like an intermediate point between two other fossils. So if we didn't quite know what this fossil in this upper rock strata was, we could use the transitional fossil to figure out whether it was older or later than something beneath it, for instance. So we can use known fossils to figure out the ages of new fossils as well. So that's what relative dating is. So again, it doesn't give us an exact age, but it does give us a time frame. We then have absolute dating. So unlike relative dating, this gives us an absolute age of the fossil. So it's a lot more accurate and a lot more precise in the age that we can give it. So radioactive dating is the most commonly used technique. And this is when we use radioactive isotopes that are found in fossils. We compare them to stable amounts in the atmosphere. So things that are dead and decaying, they're probably going to have elements in them that are going to start to decay as well and become radioactive. And we can look at that and we can compare it to what a typical normal alive organism has in its body, and we can figure out how old it is from looking at the ratio of those radioactive isotopes. So we normally use radioisotopes. The most common one we use is carbon-14. So carbon-14 is a radioisotope. It's an unstable element. And what that means is that it is going to break down and decay. And this one decays into nitrogen-14. So this is probably the most common one we use. And we're going to go through this one in the next slide. But it's based on using these radioisotopes, and it's based on these unstable elements breaking down. The breakdown is constant, and this is really important because it's constant, it can be modeled. So that means that we can pretty much know exactly when something died and therefore how old it is. And it can be modeled because the half-lives of radioisotopes are very consistent. So a half-life is basically the time that's taken for half of the mass of a radioisotope to break down into its products. So for instance, the half-life for carbon-14 is 5,730 years. So that's very specific because it is really, really consistent. So this carbon-14 element is going to be halved in mass every 5,730 years. And then in another 5,730 years, it would have halved again. And it halves and halves and halves. And then we can figure out how old it is. So we can use a lot of different radioisotopes. We're going to go through carbon-14 specifically today, but they can ask you about any, and they'll give you the half-life of it as well. And you'll need to be able to use that to be able to calculate how old a fossil is. So we're going to look at radiocarbon dating, which is that carbon-14 radioisotope, and we're going to look at its breakdown into nitrogen-14. So we know that all living things contain carbon. They contain the stable isotope of carbon, of course, and we also contain some radioactive isotopes of carbon as well. So the ratio of carbon isotopes is the same in living organisms and the atmosphere. So the amount of C12 equals the amount of C14 in all living things. When something dies, that's when that ratio starts to change. So when something dies, our carbon-14 is going to start to decay into nitrogen-14 due to radioactivity. Our C12, though, our stable carbon, remains the same. So we can calculate the ratio between our stable carbon-12 and the decay of our unstable carbon-14 to figure out what the age of our fossil is. So you can see that in this bottom graph here. So the blue line represents carbon-12, and you can see in this dead organism that remains consistent. Then you can see in the green, that is our carbon-14. So you can see every 5,730 years, that line's not very good, but you can see that the mass of our carbon-14 molecules has gone exactly half, has been cut exactly in half. So if we found a organism that had 50% carbon-14 in it, we can probably pretty accurately predict that fossil is about 5,730 years old. If you go another 5,730 years, you can see that it's been halved again, okay? So we've gone from 50% mass to 25% mass, and it will keep going like this, and we can pretty accurately determine how old our fossil is. So at any point we can measure the amount of carbon-14 present, and we can determine how long ago it died, and we can use these ratios. So over here as well is another graph that's looking at that. So you can see every half-life we go down by half. So one half-life, we're down to 0.5. Another half-life, 0.25. Another half-life will be half of that, again, and again, etc., etc. So this is a little diagram that represents this as well. So carbon-14 dating, because eventually the carbon-14 levels are going to hit zero. So carbon-14 is normally used for relatively newer organisms because the limit for carbon-14 dating is about 30,000 years. If we're wanting to date something that we think is going to be older than that, we'd use a different radioisotope such as uranium, which has a lot longer half-life, and then we can give that a more accurate dating. So the atmosphere and all living things are made up of C12 and C14, like we said. So C12 equals C14 in living things. When something dies, C12 stays the same, carbon-14 begins to decay. Every 5,730 years, the amount of C14 is going to half. So you can see here that we've started with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've started with 7 C14s over here, okay? So we would be left with, I'm not sure why this is missing, we'd be left with another half as well, although halves don't really exist in it, but you know, it gets the picture across. So if we started with, let's say I'm actually going to cut one of these off. Not sure why there's an extra one there at all, actually. So if we started with 6 carbon-14s, which is unrealistic, it's going to be a lot more elements than that. If we started with 6 carbon-14s, after half-life, we're going to have 3 nitrogens. In another 5,730 years, we would have 1.5 nitrogens left. So it's just halving. And we can, by measuring how much nitrogen-14 is in the organism, we can determine how long it has been dead for and therefore how old the fossil is. So we can use a variety of dating techniques to figure out how old something is, even if it's been fossilized thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And this is going to help us determine the relatedness between species, which we'll go through in our next video. So hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, bring them to class and I will see you there.